It was the beginning of May, 2021, when Catherine Carter, freshly emerged from the wreckage of a bitter divorce, moved into a small yet modern apartment in Lakeview, Chicago. The summer was creeping in, bringing with it the promise of change, though the weight of her past still loomed over her. At 42, Catherine was more than just a woman in her prime, she was a woman adrift. The city's vibrant energy echoed through the walls of her apartment, but inside, Catherine felt utterly alone. The bustling streets outside stood in stark contrast to the emptiness she felt within. Once, she had been married, her life entwined with another person. But that was before the love turned cold, before the reality of betrayal broke her heart in ways she never thought possible. Now, Catherine found herself standing on the precipice of a new life, one that was supposed to be filled with freedom and possibility, yet she struggled to see beyond the pain. Her daughter, Sophie Carter, was the one thread that still anchored her to the world. At 17, Sophie was bright and full of ambition, with dreams of attending a prestigious university and making a name for herself in the city. Her life, though still wrapped in the innocence of youth, was growing increasingly distant from her mother's quiet suffering. Sophie didn't see it. She was consumed with her own world, her friends, her future, and the relationships that were blossoming in her life. Catherine knew this day would come, when Sophie would no longer need her in the same way. But it didn't make it any easier. The two women, though living under the same roof, had become strangers to each other in many ways. Sophie, in the midst of her own search for identity, had grown more distant from her mother in recent months. Her once bright, effervescent personality now carried a quiet, almost cold edge. She was focused, driven, and intent on pursuing her dreams, but as the days passed, Catherine found herself losing touch with the daughter she once knew so well. Sophie's attention had shifted elsewhere. And though Catherine tried to bridge the gap, it seemed to widen with each passing day. And then, there was Ethan Parker. He had first entered their lives as Sophie's boyfriend, charming, confident, and charismatic. At 19, Ethan was everything Sophie could have asked for in a partner, handsome, funny, and supportive. But as time wore on, Catherine began to notice something else about him. There was a maturity in Ethan's eyes, a certain knowing, that hinted at something deeper, something hidden just beneath the surface. He wasn't the innocent young man he appeared to be. At first, Catherine pushed the thought away. He was just Sophie's boyfriend, after all, harmless. But the more Ethan came around, the more Catherine found herself drawn to him. It started innocently enough, conversations about movies, books, and life in the city. They discovered shared interests, finding common ground in the mundane things that made up their lives. Over time, their discussions shifted from casual to personal, and Catherine couldn't help but notice the subtle way Ethan began to make her feel seen, valued, something she hadn't felt in a long time. He listened to her, really listened, as if he understood the quiet sadness that hovered over her. Each time he visited, the air in the apartment seemed to change. Sophie and Ethan, in their youthful exuberance, brought life to Catherine's somber world. She found herself laughing at jokes she wouldn't have entertained before, and feeling a warmth inside her that she thought had gone cold. Ethan's compliments, his easy smile, and his ability to make her feel young again, he was magnetic, and Catherine couldn't ignore the pull. Every word he spoke seemed to cut through the silence that had settled in her life. But it was more than that. As they shared more dinners, more conversations, the chemistry between Catherine and Ethan grew undeniable. What had begun as simple companionship evolved into something else, something Catherine tried to convince herself wasn't there. There were lingering glances, subtle touches, and moments when she felt her heart flutter in ways that should have been reserved for someone much older, much more appropriate than a young man half her age. But those feelings, buried deep beneath her guilt, were impossible to ignore. By June, Catherine found herself at a crossroads. She was at once both excited and terrified by the growing connection between herself and Ethan. His presence had shifted something within her, reawakened a part of her that had lain dormant for years. She wasn't sure if she could allow herself to embrace it, but every encounter with him made it harder to stay away. The world outside, with all its distractions and responsibilities, seemed to blur when Ethan was around. It wasn't just Sophie anymore who was taking up space in Catherine's world. Ethan had firmly carved out his own place, one that Catherine hadn't anticipated, one that both thrilled and terrified her. And in those fleeting, stolen moments, as they shared laughter, exchanged words that lingered too long, Catherine couldn't help but wonder if this was where it all began. Where everything changed. By the end of June, 2021, the lines between friendship and something deeper had begun to blur. Ethan Parker, once just Sophie's charming boyfriend, had become a constant presence in Catherine's life. What began as a simple connection, a shared love of classic films, music, and life in the city, soon blossomed into something far more complicated, something neither of them could ignore. At first, Catherine had rationalized their connection as harmless. After all, Ethan was still very much a part of Sophie's life, and there was nothing inappropriate about the casual conversations they shared. Yet, as the weeks went on, Catherine began to notice the subtle shifts in the way Ethan looked at her. The way his eyes lingered just a little too long. The gentle touch on her shoulder when he laughed at one of her jokes. These small gestures ignited something inside Catherine, a spark she had long forgotten existed. Every glance felt electric, every word he spoke held weight. His presence made her feel something she hadn't felt in years, alive. Catherine found herself eagerly awaiting Ethan's visits. They would talk about everything, from books to the complexities of city life. She marveled at how easy it was to connect with him, how he seemed to understand her in ways no one else did. Ethan was insightful, mature beyond his years, and yet he had a lightness to him, a playfulness, that made Catherine feel carefree for the first time in a long while. In his presence, she felt seen, appreciated. She hadn't realized how much she had craved that until now. His admiration was like a balm to her wounded soul, healing the cracks she had spent years trying to ignore. It wasn't just the intellectual connection. There was an undeniable physical attraction that Catherine tried desperately to suppress. She had been so used to suppressing her desires, her needs, for the sake of her family, that the emotions Ethan stirred in her felt foreign. Yet, every time he walked into the room, that old feeling of excitement stirred in her chest. His smile was enough to make her heart race. The way his voice dropped when he spoke to her, low and soothing, sent a shiver down her spine. Ethan knew just how to make her feel special, making her feel desirable in a way she hadn't felt in years. It was during one of those casual dinners that the first true shift occurred. The apartment, once a quiet sanctuary, was filled with laughter and easy conversation. Sophie, engrossed in her phone, barely noticed how Catherine and Ethan had slipped into a world of their own. As they spoke about a favorite film, their knees brushed under the table, an innocent accident. But for Catherine, the sensation was electric. She tried to brush it off as nothing, but it lingered. She could feel the heat between them, the connection growing stronger with every passing second. Ethan, sensing the tension in the air, smiled softly at her. It wasn't the smile of a teenage boy trying to charm his girlfriend's mother, it was something different, something laden with meaning. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the apartment shifted. Sophie, oblivious to the subtle changes, excused herself, leaving Catherine and Ethan alone in the quiet of the apartment. For the first time, Catherine felt a weight in the air, a pressure she couldn't quite explain. There was an undeniable chemistry between them now, and it was impossible to pretend otherwise. "I never thought I'd meet someone who gets it," Catherine said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "It's been so long since I've felt understood." Ethan's gaze softened as he looked at her, his eyes locked with hers in a way that sent a shiver through Catherine's spine. He leaned in slightly, just enough to close the distance between them, and smiled. "I know what you mean," he said, his voice low, like a promise hanging in the air. "I don't think I've ever met anyone who sees things the way you do." It was in that moment, with his gaze fixed on hers and the faintest hint of a smile on his lips, that Catherine felt the line between harmless connection and something far more dangerous begin to crumble. The desire, the attraction, it all rushed to the surface. That night, Catherine found herself awake long after Ethan had left, her mind racing. She replayed their conversation, his words, his smile. It wasn't just flirtation, it was something more. Something deeper, unspoken, and yet undeniable. The following week, Ethan's visits became more frequent. He would drop by after Sophie's classes or stay late after a movie, finding excuses to linger in her company. Each time, Catherine's heart would flutter in anticipation. She knew it was wrong, that she should step back and put up boundaries, but with each moment, she found herself unable to. Ethan was a breath of fresh air, an escape from the weight of her own reality. He made her feel like she was more than just a mother, more than just a woman with a past, he made her feel alive. But Catherine wasn't the only one feeling the pull. Ethan, too, was drawn to her. Despite the age difference, there was something in Catherine that captivated him. Perhaps it was her strength, the way she held herself despite everything life had thrown at her. Or perhaps it was her vulnerability, something about the way she opened up to him in their conversations, letting him see the parts of her no one else had ever seen. It was intoxicating. Their relationship, once innocent and casual, was now teetering on the edge of something forbidden. Catherine knew she was playing with fire, but it was a fire she couldn't seem to resist. The emotional and physical connection between her and Ethan had grown so intense, so palpable, that it was impossible to ignore. And each time he left, she was left with a longing, a hunger, for something more. But Catherine's heart ached with the realization that she was treading on dangerous ground. She was Sophie's mother, she had no business feeling this way about her daughter's boyfriend. And yet, the desire was there, as real as the breath in her lungs. The question now was not if their relationship would continue to grow, it was whether Catherine could stop it before it consumed them both. The lines had already been crossed. And now, there was no turning back. By the time July rolled around, Catherine's world had become a web of tension, guilt, and unspoken truths. As the sun blazed overhead, the heat in the apartment seemed to mirror the simmering emotions between her and Sophie. What had once been a warm, close relationship between mother and daughter was now becoming strained, stretched thin by the distance Catherine had unintentionally placed between them. Sophie, no longer the carefree teenager she had been just a few months ago, began to sense that something was off, something that Catherine was no longer willing to share. Sophie, at 17, was on the cusp of adulthood, her mind preoccupied with securing a future, with college applications, and a blossoming social life. She had long since focused on her own dreams, seeking independence, but Catherine's sudden withdrawal had shaken her. The once bright, effervescent girl had started to notice the subtle changes in her mother's behavior. Catherine, once so present in her life, had become distant. Her mother, who used to join her in movie marathons and stay up late discussing life, now retreated into herself more and more, her eyes cloudy with thoughts Sophie couldn't begin to understand. At first, Sophie chalked it up to the lingering effects of the divorce, Catherine still processing the hurt, still reeling from the breakup. But the silence between them had grown so heavy that Sophie couldn't ignore it anymore. It was as though her mother was retreating into herself, and with every day that passed, Sophie felt more like an outsider in her own home. The warmth they once shared in their conversations was now a faint memory, replaced by awkward silences, strained smiles, and half-hearted attempts at conversation. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her mother had been acting strangely for weeks, distracted, distant, almost absent. Catherine had been staring at her phone more than usual, her attention often drifting. Sophie had tried to talk to her, but the conversations always seemed to fizzle out, leaving her with a sense of unease. The last time they had talked about her future, her mother's eyes had glazed over, as though she wasn't really listening. And then there was Ethan. It started as a nagging suspicion, a small inkling in the back of Sophie's mind, something she couldn't quite put her finger on but couldn't ignore either. Ethan's presence in their home had become more frequent, more intense. He would come over for dinner, join them for a drink, stay late into the evening. Sophie didn't mind, at first. After all, he was her boyfriend, and Catherine had always been open and friendly with him. But now, as she observed the way her mother interacted with him, Sophie couldn't deny that something felt off. There was a closeness between them that went beyond politeness. Sophie noticed the lingering glances, the shared laughter that seemed to echo a little too deeply between Catherine and Ethan. The way they exchanged looks when they thought no one was watching. It felt different. Sophie couldn't pinpoint it, but the change was unmistakable. The realization hit Sophie like a wave, crashing over her with a mixture of disbelief and nausea. Her mother was distant, yes, but it wasn't just because of the divorce. No, it was something far more insidious. Ethan wasn't just her boyfriend anymore, he was part of the emotional distance between them. And Sophie, who had once trusted her mother with her whole heart, felt betrayed in ways she hadn't anticipated. She didn't know when it started, but she knew it now. The bond she had once shared with Catherine was slipping away, slipping into something darker, something she didn't understand. The more Sophie tried to reach her mother, the more Catherine withdrew. The more Sophie tried to engage, the more Catherine seemed to retreat into a world of her own, a world where Ethan had become a fixture. One evening, the weight of it all became too much for Sophie to bear. She had been in her room, scrolling through social media, when she overheard Catherine and Ethan talking in the living room. The conversation was soft, low, too intimate to ignore. She could make out some of their words, their laughter laced with something that felt too familiar, too personal. Sophie froze, a sinking feeling in her stomach. Her suspicions were confirmed, but the sting of betrayal was sharper than she could have ever anticipated. Her heart raced as the realization hit her, her mother and Ethan were more than just acquaintances. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Sophie felt trapped between two worlds, the world where she had once trusted her mother completely, and the harsh, painful reality that she was no longer the center of Catherine's world. It was as though she had been pushed aside for someone else, a man who wasn't just Sophie's boyfriend, but now, somehow, part of Catherine's life in a way she had never imagined. Sophie's mind whirled as she replayed their conversations in her head, the looks exchanged, the touches that lingered too long. Each memory felt like a knife in her chest, twisting and turning as the weight of the betrayal settled in. She couldn't breathe. That night, Sophie lay awake in bed, her thoughts a chaotic mess. The anger swirled inside her, building up with every second. She wanted to confront her mother, wanted to scream, to demand answers. But the words caught in her throat. What could she even say? How could she accuse Catherine of something she wasn't ready to face herself? The following days were tense. Sophie tried to act normal, to pretend nothing had changed, but the chasm between her and Catherine grew with every passing moment. The warmth, the closeness that once defined their relationship was gone, replaced by a painful silence. Sophie began to pull away, retreating into her own world, just as Catherine had. Neither of them knew how to bridge the gap that had formed between them. And so, the house grew quieter. The laughter, the shared moments, the bond they once had, they were all fading. Catherine's silence, once filled with sadness, now seemed almost purposeful. Sophie, once the girl who could share everything with her mother, now found herself standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure of how or if she could ever reach back to the woman who had always been her greatest support. The rift had formed, and with it, a sense of loss that neither of them knew how to fix. The deeper Sophie looked into the growing divide between them, the more she realized, the woman she had once trusted was no longer the same. And the man who had once been just a boyfriend now seemed to have stolen something far more precious than just her mother's attention. The summer heat of 2021 had become unbearable, both outside and inside the apartment. The silence between mother and daughter grew heavier by the day, each glance, each word laced with unspoken tension. Catherine had become a stranger in her own home, her every action now dictated by the guilt and fear of what she was hiding. Ethan's presence had escalated, a constant reminder of the secret she was desperate to keep from Sophie. But the cracks in her facade were widening, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would come out. Sophie had spent the past week trying to convince herself that she was overreacting. She had been paranoid, perhaps, feeling a growing distance between herself and Catherine. It was normal for things to shift as she became more independent, wasn't it? But deep down, Sophie knew something was wrong. She had caught snippets of conversations, seen the way her mother looked at Ethan when she thought no one was watching. The soft smiles, the lingering touches. The small, almost imperceptible shifts that signaled a bond growing deeper than anything Sophie could accept. It was late one evening when Sophie's suspicions finally became undeniable. She had been working on her college applications in her room, the soft hum of the city outside her window providing a constant background noise. The apartment was quiet, with only the faint sounds of her mother and Ethan talking in the living room. She had been ignoring it for hours, but as time passed, the conversation seemed to take on a different tone. Sophie felt her pulse quicken. There was something in the air tonight, something that felt off. With her heart pounding in her chest, Sophie couldn't resist the urge to move closer. She crept down the hallway, careful not to make a sound, her feet barely touching the floorboards. She reached the corner just outside the living room and paused, her breath shallow. Through the crack in the doorway, Sophie could hear their voices, soft, intimate, too close for comfort. It wasn't the usual polite exchange she was used to hearing between them. There was laughter, yes, but it was different. It wasn't the easy, carefree laughter that came with casual conversation. No, this was something else. It was more personal, more intense. Sophie's stomach twisted as she stood frozen, the weight of the situation sinking in. She leaned in closer, just enough to make out some of the words. She heard Ethan's voice, low and filled with warmth. "You look beautiful tonight, Catherine. I can't help but notice how much you've changed since we first started talking." Sophie's heart dropped into her stomach. Her mother didn't respond immediately. Sophie could almost picture Catherine, the slight hesitation in her voice before she replied, "I've just been needing something to change, Ethan. Something to feel alive again." The words hit Sophie like a slap across the face. She didn't need to hear any more. The truth was right there, plain as day. Her mother wasn't just emotionally distant, she was involved in something far more dangerous, something that Sophie hadn't been prepared for. Her mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears as the realization struck her like a freight train. Catherine and Ethan, her mother and her boyfriend, had crossed a line. With a deep breath, Sophie turned away from the door. She didn't know what to do, how to process this betrayal. Everything she thought she knew about her mother, about her family, was shattered in that moment. The anger, the hurt, it all came rushing in, overwhelming her. She couldn't just stand there anymore, couldn't pretend she didn't know. She needed answers. Sophie stormed into the living room, her emotions boiling over. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of rage and heartbreak. Catherine looked up, her face pale, eyes wide with shock. Ethan, standing by the window, froze, sensing the gravity of the moment. Sophie's gaze locked onto her mother, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "How long, Mom?" Sophie's words were sharp, each one dripping with hurt. "How long has this been going on? Behind my back? How could you?" Catherine's face turned an unnatural shade of white as the weight of the truth sank in. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She had never expected this moment to come so soon, and certainly not like this. For the first time in years, Catherine was speechless. She had built her own walls around this secret, convinced that she could keep it hidden, that it would remain her own private escape from the world. But Sophie had found it, and the floodgates of her betrayal had been opened wide. Ethan stepped forward, his face tense, his posture defensive. He opened his mouth, perhaps to explain himself, but Sophie cut him off before he could say a word. "No," she spat, "don't you dare try to justify this. You, both of you, betrayed me. I trusted you." The words were like daggers, each one piercing deeper than the last. Her mother, the woman who was supposed to protect her, had not only let her down but had crossed a line that was unforgivable. Catherine's gaze dropped to the floor, shame and guilt flooding her. She opened her mouth to apologize, to explain, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't tell Sophie the truth, not the whole truth. Not how Ethan had made her feel alive again, or how much she had needed the attention, the connection he had given her. The guilt was overwhelming, and yet, in the deepest part of her, there was a part of her that didn't want to let go of him. Sophie's eyes welled up with tears, but her anger burned brighter than the pain. "How could you do this to me?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "How could you do this to us?" The tears were now streaming down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She couldn't hide the truth anymore, couldn't keep pretending. The rift between them had already formed, and Sophie knew in that moment, nothing would ever be the same again. Catherine stood motionless, unable to find the words to make it right. Ethan, still hovering in the background, knew his presence was only making things worse. But what could he say? He had become part of the web of deceit, part of the fracture in their family. There was no going back now. Sophie turned and walked away, her heart shattered into a million pieces. She didn't know where to go or what to do, but she couldn't stay in that house with them anymore. The world as she knew it was falling apart, and she was powerless to stop it. All she could do was leave, to escape the painful reality that the mother she had once trusted, the one who was supposed to protect her, had broken her heart in the worst way possible. The aftermath of Sophie's confrontation with Catherine was like a hurricane that tore through the family's fragile walls. The air in the apartment grew thick with tension, each breath feeling heavier than the last. The emotional intensity of the confrontation hung in the air like smoke, suffocating everything it touched. Sophie, her heart breaking with every step, had stormed off, leaving Catherine standing in the wreckage of her own mistakes. Ethan had stood awkwardly in the background, unsure of how to navigate the storm he had inadvertently helped unleash. But that night, nothing had prepared Catherine for what would come next. After Sophie's departure, Catherine found herself alone with Ethan in the stillness of the apartment. The weight of the conversation still loomed, but there was something more pressing now, something she couldn't ignore. Ethan's presence, once a comfort, now felt like a shackle around her wrist. The thrill of their secret affair had lost its shine, and all that was left was the raw reality of what they had done, of the irreparable damage they had caused. Ethan, standing by the window, his back turned to her, spoke first. His voice was quiet, a slight tremor betraying his calm exterior. "She won't forgive us, Catherine," he said, his words cutting through the silence. "You saw the way she looked at us. She's never going to forget this." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She had known that Sophie's betrayal would be a bitter pill to swallow, but hearing Ethan say it out loud made it all the more real. Her daughter, the one person she had fought to protect all her life, now despised her. Catherine's chest tightened as she tried to think of a way to make it right, to somehow bridge the gap she had created between them. But the truth was, she couldn't. Not after what they had done. The damage was too deep. Ethan turned to face her, his eyes darkened with something more than guilt, something Catherine couldn't quite place. "What if it's too late? What if she never talks to you again? What if?" The words were cut short by a loud crash in the living room, followed by a sharp gasp from Catherine. She turned toward the sound, her heart racing in her chest. Ethan had moved too quickly, or perhaps his own emotional state had taken over. His body collided with the table, knocking over a glass of wine that shattered against the floor. The sound reverberated through the apartment, an eerie echo that seemed to set the scene for what was about to unfold. Catherine rushed over to him, her voice trembling. "Ethan, are you okay?" Her eyes darted from him to the broken glass, her mind momentarily distracted by the chaos. But when she reached him, something was wrong. Ethan's face was contorted in pain, and his hands were shaking as they clutched his side. Blood, dark and thick, was beginning to stain his shirt. "Ethan!" Catherine's voice broke as she knelt beside him. Panic surged through her veins as she tried to assess the situation. His breathing was shallow, and his eyes were glassy, already clouded with fear and confusion. "What happened?" Catherine asked frantically, her hands trembling as she pressed against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. But Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he let out a groan, his body twitching beneath her touch. It was all too much for Catherine to process, too much too soon. Her mind reeled as she realized that Ethan had been hurt, and it was because of her. She had no idea how it happened, but she knew one thing for sure: if he didn't get help soon, he would die in front of her. "Ethan, stay with me!" Catherine cried out, her voice breaking with desperation. "Please, don't leave me. I need you." But the words were hollow. There was nothing she could do. Ethan's body slumped against hers, his blood pooling on the floor. The room spun around Catherine, and for a moment, she could barely breathe. She had no idea how long they had been there, her mind consumed by the horrific reality of what was happening. And then, just as suddenly as it all began, Ethan went still. The fight had left his body, his eyes closing as though he were surrendering to the darkness. Catherine sat there in stunned silence, her hands stained with his blood, her heart thundering in her chest. She couldn't process what had happened, couldn't grasp the magnitude of it all. But she knew one thing: he was dead. Ethan was gone, and she was alone with the terrifying knowledge that she had been part of the reason why. The silence in the room felt suffocating, an eerie stillness that seemed to echo around her. Catherine's mind raced, but there was no time to grieve. There was only one thing left to do now. She had to hide it. Without thinking, Catherine quickly jumped to her feet. The panic that had surged through her moments before now took control of her actions. She couldn't let anyone know what had happened. If Sophie came back, if the authorities were called, everything would be over. The perfect life she had built would come crumbling down. With trembling hands, Catherine moved quickly, dragging Ethan's lifeless body toward the door. She couldn't think. She couldn't afford to. Every instinct in her told her to act fast, to make this disappear before it consumed her completely. She grabbed a blanket from the couch, wrapping it around him to hide the blood. It wasn't much, but it was all she could think to do in the moment. She pulled the body down the hallway, out of sight, out of Sophie's reach. For hours, Catherine worked to clean the apartment, erasing every trace of what had occurred. She scrubbed the blood from the floor, wiped away the glass shards, and moved Ethan's belongings as if he had simply left, as if he had never been there at all. But the damage had been done. The weight of what she had just done pressed down on her, suffocating her as she realized that there was no going back. No matter how much she cleaned, no matter how much she tried to cover it all up, the truth remained. Ethan was gone. And now, Catherine had a secret far darker than any she had ever kept before. She had taken part in ending a life. She had buried the truth beneath lies and blood, and there was no turning back. The guilt began to consume her, but there was nothing she could do. She had made her choice. And now, she would live with it forever. The days following Ethan's death were a blur of anxiety and fear. Catherine's world, already shattered by her own actions, now spun wildly out of control. The apartment, once filled with the hum of normal life, now felt suffocating, each creak of the floorboards, each passing siren outside, a reminder that the lie she had so carefully crafted was fragile, hanging by a thread. The weight of what she had done pressed on her chest like a stone, but it wasn't just the guilt that consumed her, it was the constant fear of discovery. Ethan's absence had not gone unnoticed. Though Sophie had never gotten the chance to confront him directly, she had spent the last few days calling him, texting him, asking if he was all right. Ethan had vanished without a trace, and the sudden void left behind in his absence gnawed at Sophie, her worry escalating with each unanswered call. It wasn't long before she began asking questions that Catherine couldn't answer. Catherine, for her part, had become a master at hiding the truth. Every moment in the apartment felt like a performance, each action carefully calculated, every word measured. She kept the apartment spotless, erasing all traces of the chaos that had unfolded. The bloodstains on the floor were scrubbed away, and the shards of broken glass were carefully disposed of. Ethan's personal belongings, his jacket, his phone, were neatly placed by the door, as if he had left in a hurry. It was the perfect illusion of his sudden departure. But no matter how meticulously she arranged the scene, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that Sophie might soon piece together the truth. Sophie's suspicions had only grown. The once warm and open relationship between mother and daughter had now become strained to its breaking point. Sophie had been trying to bury her hurt, but it wasn't easy. Every conversation with Catherine felt rehearsed, as if her mother was hiding something. She knew her mother too well to believe the stories she told about Ethan's sudden disappearance. Catherine, once so warm and engaged, now seemed distracted, too focused on hiding her secrets. Sophie had started to pay closer attention, noticing every little detail that didn't add up. The subtle changes in Catherine's behavior, her late-night phone calls, her guarded responses when Sophie asked about Ethan, only deepened Sophie's fears. And then came the knock on the door. It was a Saturday morning when the police arrived at the apartment. Sophie was still in her room, catching up on her studies, when she heard the firm, deliberate sound of knocking. It wasn't the kind of knock a neighbor would make, nor the friendly tap of a friend checking in. This was official. The police had arrived, and with them, the chilling reality that everything Catherine had worked to conceal was about to unravel. Sophie's heart skipped a beat, and the color drained from her face. She didn't know why the police were here, but she had a sinking feeling that this was about to change everything. Catherine, already on edge, felt her blood run cold as she opened the door. Two detectives stood on the threshold, one tall, broad-shouldered, and serious, the other smaller, with a piercing gaze that seemed to see right through her. They introduced themselves, showing her their badges. "Mrs. Carter," the taller detective said in a low voice, "we're investigating the disappearance of Ethan Parker. May we come in?" For a moment, Catherine could only nod, her mouth dry, her mind racing as she led them inside. She did her best to maintain her composure, but the tightness in her chest, the panic swelling up within her, made it almost impossible to think straight. The apartment felt too small, too suffocating. Every inch of it reminded her of what she had done, every corner felt like a trap. The detective sat down, and Catherine stood by the kitchen counter, trying to appear calm, but her mind was anything but. They asked her about Ethan, when she had last seen him, if she had noticed anything unusual, anything out of place. Catherine tried to remain composed, giving them polite, rehearsed answers, but as the questions grew more probing, she felt her control slipping. "We've spoken to some of Ethan's friends," the smaller detective said, his voice casual but sharp. "None of them have heard from him. His phone is off, and he hasn't returned any of his messages. His family is worried, too." The word struck Catherine like a blow. She could feel her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to stay calm. If she faltered now, if she gave them any hint that something was wrong, the game would be up. As the questions continued, Catherine's mind raced. Her answers came more quickly now, but they felt hollow, rehearsed. She had to maintain the lie, had to keep up the appearance of the grieving mother, the concerned citizen. She couldn't let them see the cracks in her story. But Sophie, standing at the top of the stairs, had heard enough. Her heart pounded in her chest, and every word the detective spoke cut deeper than any accusation could. She had known that something was wrong, but now, seeing her mother's strained expression, the way her eyes avoided meeting the detectives, Sophie knew without a doubt, her mother was hiding something. She stepped forward, her voice shaking but resolute. "What's going on, Mom?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The tension in the room thickened as Catherine's gaze flicked to her daughter. The detectives watched, curious. "Sophie," Catherine began, her voice faltering, but before she could say anything more, Sophie cut her off. "Where is Ethan?" she demanded, her voice growing louder. "What did you do with him?" Her voice cracked, the anger and hurt overwhelming her. The detectives exchanged a quick glance, sensing the change in the atmosphere. Sophie's accusation was like the final thread in the unraveling of the facade Catherine had worked so hard to maintain. The room grew still, and in that moment, Catherine realized she could no longer keep the truth buried. Her mind was reeling, the weight of the lie, the guilt, the fear of discovery crashing down on her. The police were here, Sophie knew everything, and there was no way out. Catherine felt her world crumbling, and for the first time, she realized that there was no more hiding. The investigation was no longer just a threat, it was a reality she would have to face. The detectives moved in, asking more pointed questions, and Sophie stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, torn between confronting her mother and the overwhelming realization that the woman she had trusted most had shattered everything they once had. As the days passed, the weight of the investigation grew heavier. The detectives had come and gone, their questions growing more probing with each visit. Sophie, no longer able to stay silent, had become increasingly consumed by her suspicions. The guilt in her mother's eyes, the way Catherine avoided her gaze, the fragile stories she told, they all seemed to confirm what Sophie had feared. The truth had been buried too deep for too long, and now it was clawing its way to the surface. But Catherine's attempts to protect her secret only seemed to draw Sophie further away. She could no longer ignore the truth. The twists in her own family's story were growing impossible to deny. The more she thought about it, the more pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, but none of them made sense together. The tangled web of betrayal and deceit was suffocating, and Sophie was caught at its center. The tension in the apartment had reached its breaking point. Sophie's discovery and the investigation into Ethan's disappearance had created a chasm between mother and daughter that seemed unbridgeable. Every time Catherine tried to explain herself, Sophie shut her down. Every conversation felt like an accusation, a subtle reminder of the betrayal, and a cruel twist of fate that had torn them apart. Catherine, meanwhile, was living in a constant state of panic. The detectives had continued their inquiries, and though she had managed to avoid making any direct mistakes, Catherine's nerves were beginning to unravel. She couldn't keep the walls up forever. She had lived with a lie for so long, convinced herself that the truth would never surface, but now, with each passing day, it seemed inevitable. Then, it happened. It was a Tuesday evening, and Catherine had just finished tidying up the apartment when the phone rang. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the caller ID, Detective Harris. The knot in her stomach tightened. She picked up the phone, her voice wavering as she said hello. "Mrs. Carter, we need you to come down to the station," Detective Harris said, his voice calm but firm. "We have some new information regarding Ethan Parker's disappearance, and we need you to clarify a few things." Catherine's heart sank. She had expected this, but now that it was happening, the reality hit her like a freight train. Sophie was in the next room, and Catherine could feel her daughter's eyes on her, though she didn't turn to face her. She couldn't risk showing any sign of weakness. Not now. Sophie had grown increasingly withdrawn, yet the distance between them was still palpable. She knew something was wrong, but Catherine didn't have the strength to face her daughter, to tell her the truth. Instead, she grabbed her coat and left the apartment, her steps heavy as she walked out the door, heading for the police station. As Catherine sat in the waiting room of the precinct, a sense of dread overwhelmed her. The moment she walked into the room with the detectives, she knew she would be pushed into a corner. There would be no more escaping the truth, no more pretending that everything was fine. The walls were closing in, and she had nowhere left to run. She took a deep breath and walked in, ready to face whatever was coming. But when Detective Harris spoke, it wasn't the questioning she had expected. Instead, he handed her a folder, his expression unreadable. "We've been looking into Ethan's recent activities," he said, his voice calm. "There's something you should know. We found his phone, hidden under a bench in the park across the street from your apartment. The last message he sent was to you." Catherine's blood ran cold as she took the folder from him. Inside was a printout of the final message Ethan had sent before his disappearance. The words on the page burned into her memory, sending a chill down her spine. "I know you can't do this anymore. It's all falling apart. I'm scared of what will happen next. But I can't walk away from you." Catherine's heart dropped into her stomach. The implications were clear. Ethan had known the truth. He had known that their affair couldn't continue, that the lies had to end. And yet, he had been caught between his own feelings and the reality of the situation. He had been desperate to hold on to something, even though he knew it would only destroy him in the end. Catherine stammered, struggling to find words. The truth was closing in on her, suffocating her, and she couldn't breathe. She had been holding on to this secret for so long, convinced that it would never come out, but now, here it was, in black and white. The guilt and the fear surged, and she felt herself unraveling in front of the detective. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted this. I thought I could fix it, that I could make everything right. But it all went wrong." Detective Harris remained silent, watching her with a calm, almost detached expression. "We know, Mrs. Carter," he said quietly. "We know about your relationship with Ethan Parker. But there's more to the story. You see, the thing is, we found something else on his phone, something we didn't expect." Catherine's eyes widened, and her heart seemed to stop beating as the detective placed a second sheet of paper in front of her. It was a photograph, a grainy image of Ethan, but it wasn't just a photo of him alone. In the background, Catherine could see herself, her face barely visible, but unmistakably hers. The photo had been taken from a distance, taken without her knowledge. "This was taken outside your apartment building," Detective Harris continued. "Just days before Ethan's disappearance. Someone else was there. Someone who had been watching you." Catherine's throat went dry. Who else could have been watching? She was sure that no one had known what had happened. No one, except for her and Ethan. But the detective's words left a gnawing feeling in her gut. "The truth is," Detective Harris said, "we believe Ethan was planning to tell someone everything, about you, about the affair, about what had been happening between the two of you. And we think he was planning to go public with it." Catherine's breath hitched, the final realization dawning on her. Ethan had been the one with the upper hand, the one who could have brought everything into the light. But before he could expose the truth, something had happened. Someone had stepped in. The detectives paused, allowing the weight of the revelation to sink in. Catherine's mind raced, her thoughts a blur as everything she had kept hidden was slowly dragged out into the open. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter," Detective Harris said, his voice steady. "We believe that Ethan's death was not an accident. It was deliberate." Catherine's world spun. She was now the suspect. She had done everything to cover it up, but in doing so, she had only dug herself deeper. Ethan had been silenced, and now the truth was chasing her. She couldn't run anymore. And as Catherine left the precinct, she felt the walls closing in, the reality of her actions crushing her under their weight. There was no going back. The investigation, the lies, the secrets, everything was unraveling. The future was uncertain, and now, Catherine had no choice but to face the consequences of what she had done. The truth had finally come to light, but the path ahead was darker than she could ever have imagined. As she stepped into the night, the open road before her seemed like the only thing she could hold on to. But even then, the shadows were closing in. The following weeks were a blur of police visits, tense phone calls, and a constant stream of questions Catherine couldn't answer. The truth had finally started to come to light, and there was no escaping it. The whispers in the neighborhood, the concerned faces of friends and family who had noticed the growing rift in the Carter household, everything had come crashing down. Sophie, still struggling with the immense pain of betrayal, now stood at the epicenter of her mother's destruction. And Catherine? She had spent days avoiding eye contact with Sophie, afraid of what her daughter might say, what Sophie might do once the truth was out in the open. But no matter how much she tried to shield herself, she knew the inevitable was closing in, the consequences of her actions were coming for her. The police had become a constant presence in the apartment, questioning both Catherine and Sophie about Ethan's disappearance. Every conversation, every interaction, was a dance around the uncomfortable truth that neither of them wanted to admit. Catherine's mind was in a constant state of panic. She replayed every moment, every decision she had made, wondering where it all went wrong. Ethan was dead, and she had covered up the truth, thinking she could protect herself, thinking she could escape. But now, the truth was haunting her, and there was no place left to hide. Sophie, meanwhile, had become a shell of her former self. The vibrant young woman, full of ambition and hope, had been replaced by someone who was broken, questioning everything she once believed in. She could no longer look at her mother without seeing the betrayal. The gap between them had grown to an unbridgeable chasm, and no amount of words could fix what had been broken. Catherine tried to reach out, to apologize, but Sophie had pushed her away, her trust shattered beyond repair. The days stretched on in a suffocating silence. Catherine's guilt gnawed at her, the weight of her choices too much to bear. The police, after weeks of digging, had finally found enough evidence to charge her. The discovery of Ethan's phone, the messages between them, the hidden photographs, all of it pointed back to Catherine. The detectives had pieced together the truth, and now, the inevitable was about to happen. Catherine had run out of excuses, out of time. The day Catherine was arrested, Sophie was at school. Catherine knew the moment had arrived, the moment when her life would change forever. As she was led out of the apartment in handcuffs, her heart was heavy with shame. She couldn't look at Sophie, couldn't face her. All she could think about was how everything had unraveled so quickly. She had once believed that love, passion, and secrecy could shield her from the consequences of her actions, but now she understood the bitter truth: no secret remains hidden forever. The police took Catherine away, and Sophie arrived home to find the apartment eerily quiet. She knew, without needing to be told, that her mother had been arrested. The sight of the empty living room, the place that had once been their sanctuary, now felt cold and distant. Her mother, the woman she had loved and trusted more than anyone in the world, was now a criminal in her eyes. The betrayal was too much for Sophie to bear, and the tears that came that night weren't just for Ethan, they were for the mother she had lost, the family she had once known. The truth, no matter how much she had wished to deny it, was out. The consequences were real. And Sophie, as much as it hurt, would never see her mother in the same way again. Was Catherine's desire to feel alive again enough of a justification for what she did? Or was the betrayal too much to ever excuse? Can Sophie ever truly forgive her mother for what happened, or is their bond irreparably broken? What would you have done if you were in Catherine's shoes? Would you have come clean, or would you have tried to cover up the truth like she did? What do you think about this tragic tale of betrayal and the destruction of trust? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts with us. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And don't forget to share this video with your friends. Let's keep the conversation going.